In the shadowed heart of a Louisiana sugar plantation, an aging mistress summoned her enslaved maid, ordered her to bolt the door from inside, and kept her there for 11 days. What unfolded behind those locked shutters was not mercy, nor madness, but something far darker. A final act of vengeance whispered in the language of sin, inheritance, and divine reckoning. The air in the autumn of 1853 hung thick with the cloying sweetness of burning cane. 40 miles south of Baton Rouge, on the decaying estate known as Bellefontaine, the Mississippi River moved like a slow, indifferent witness to generations of human toil and hidden sins. Spanish moss draped the ancient live oaks like funeral veils, muffling the world. The sugar boilers roared day and night, their orange glow staining the night sky, a hellish light that never fully died. This is the story of Madame Honorine Tibido, the last living heir of a French colonial bloodline, and the enslaved woman she chose as the instrument of her final, unthinkable will. A story not merely of cruelty, but of a soul twisting itself into a weapon against the future. Of wealth forged in chains, guarded by hatred, and perhaps, touched by the cold hand of justice from above. Let this sink in, a woman who could no longer walk unaided still commanded the power to reshape legacies. And the key to her chamber became the key to a century of buried truths. Before we descend fully into the mists of Bellefontaine, if stories of forgotten sins, hidden documents, and the haunting weight of history call to you, subscribe now. Hit the bell. Drop in the comments the city or state where you're listening from tonight. I read every one. Your presence here turns these ghosts into something living. Now, breathe in the smoke of 1853. Feel the heat of the sugar mill on your skin. Let me take you there. The big house at Bellefontaine had stood since 1741, raised on brick piers against the river's floods, its cypress walls weathered by 100 Louisiana summers, its heart pine floors darkened by time and spilled blood, literal and figurative. 6 massive oaks, planted by founder Honorine Tibido, spread their branches like protective yet judgmental arms over the wraparound gallery. By 1853, the house had outlived its purpose and its people. It creaked with memory. Madame Honorine Tibido was 73 years old. A frail shell weighing less than 90 pounds, her left side partially paralyzed by a stroke the previous winter. She moved like a ghost in her own home, supported by strong arms, yet her eyes burned with a clarity sharper than any knife in the sugar mill. Her husband Leopold had died of yellow fever 15 years earlier. Her sons, 2 in infancy, the beloved Pascal at 19 in a foolish New Orleans duel over gambling debts, were long in the ground. Only one child remained, daughter Odette, married to a St. Louis merchant and absent from Bellefontaine for over a decade. Honorine's hatred for Odette had become her final religion. A sacred, obsessive fire. She would not allow her daughter and son-in-law to inherit one single arpent of this land soaked in the sweat and suffering of the enslaved. Under Louisiana's unique adherence to the Napoleonic Code, forced heirship, the legitime, made total disinheritance nearly impossible. Nearly. But Madame had found a way. A way that required secrecy, isolation, and one quiet, literate, enduring young woman. The household that autumn was a powder keg of watchful eyes. Madame Honorine, confined to the large corner bedchamber overlooking the back gardens. Her nephew, Armand Pontalba, 34, ambitious, unmarried, arrived from New Orleans 3 years prior to help manage the estate. He had stayed, circling like a vulture. Overseer Bertrand Sickard, a Cajun from the Atchafalaya Basin, coarse, capable, violent when necessary, loyal to the highest bidder. Creole housekeeper Madame Voisin, 63, born free in Saint-Domingue, refugee of the Haitian Revolution's chaos, serving the Tibidos for 51 years. She had delivered babies, laid out corpses, and seen every sin this house could birth. And 47 enslaved souls. 9 worked the house. The rest toiled in the cane. Among the house servants rose one name above all, Saline. 26 years old. Born on Bellefontaine. Daughter of Filman, Honorine's personal seamstress who had died of consumption 2 years earlier, denied a doctor by her mistress. Saline was tall, nearly 5 feet 9 inches, quiet, steady-handed, secretly literate in French thanks to her mother's forbidden teachings. The other servants spoke of her terrible patience. A capacity to endure without breaking. Madame Voisin would later call it something else in whispered testimony, a patience that could swallow evil whole. The sugar harvest defined life. From October to Christmas, the air was poisoned with sweet smoke. Cane stalks towered like green armies. Gangs of enslaved workers swung long knives from before dawn until after dusk. Wagons groaned. Rollers crushed. Juice boiled in open copper kettles under relentless fire. Men died young accidents, exhaustion, pneumonia. The system had run unchanged since 1741. Only the names changed. The cruelty refined itself like sugar. Bellefontaine produced roughly 400 hogsheads of sugar in a good year. Income could reach $30,000, millions in today's value when including land, buildings, and human property. The 1841 will valued the entire estate, including the 47 enslaved people, at $120,000 to $150,000. A fortune built on blood. A fortune Madame Honorine now prepared to weaponize. The spiritual shadow over Bellefontaine was undeniable. This was not mere greed. It was a soul at war with legacy. Biblical echoes haunted the place, the sins of the fathers visited upon the children. The idea that wealth gained through oppression carries a curse. Honorine, in her final decline, seemed to embody the pharaoh whose heart was hardened, refusing to let go even in death. Yet perhaps divine justice moved quietly through the very hands she sought to use. Madame Voisin had survived the fall of Saint-Domingue as a child. She had crossed the sea with nothing, risen through service, witnessed the yellow fever claim Leopold, held Pascal's cold body, and watched generations cycle through pride and folly. She understood the old woman's obsession. And in her heart, the freeborn Creole had already decided, she would not let the final act of hatred complete itself unchallenged. Overseer Sickard felt the tension too. He knew the fields, the cane, the brutal rhythm. He respected Honorine as one respects a venomous snake. He disliked Pontalba. Something was ending at Bellefontaine. The harvest of 1853 promised record profits. Cane stood 11 feet high. Then, on October 12, everything shifted. Madame Honorine summoned her nephew Armand after refusing him for 8 days. She sat upright, unusual, clutching her late husband's sealed leather portfolio. Saline emerged later, the kitchen girl said, white as fresh linen. Armand rode to Donaldsonville and vanished for 3 days. On October 15, he returned with Notary Auguste Delacroix, a meticulous man of law. The notary spent 2 hours in the chamber. When he left, Madame Voisin pressed him in the corridor. His reply was cryptic. What Madame intended was not a simple revision of her testament. That evening, Saline was called upstairs. She carried the dinner tray as she had hundreds of times. The bedchamber smelled of medicine, old wood, candle wax, and the faint sweetness of decay. Heavy shutters closed out the world. A single lamp cast long, trembling shadows. Set the tray down, Honorine whispered. Close the door. Saline obeyed. Turned the key. Bolted from inside. The lock clicked. A sound like a coffin lid sealing. In a voice so low Saline had to lean close, Honorine issued her commands. Saline would remain in this room for as long as necessary. She could empty the chamber pot in the adjoining closet, but nothing more. Food would come to the door. No one entered. No one left. She would sleep on the daybed at the foot of Madame's own bed. She would speak to no one through the door. Pass nothing out. If Armand or anyone tried to force entry, Saline was to refuse. Saline, whose mother had died in agony without medical help because this woman deemed it unnecessary, said nothing. She locked the door. She sat. And for 11 days, the world outside wondered what devilry unfolded within. Imagine the room, dim light filtering through shutters. The heavy tick of a mantel clock marking time like a heartbeat. The distant roar of the sugar mill. 2 women, one dying of age and hatred, the other young and enduring, bound together in silence. What words passed? What documents were signed, rewritten, hidden? What confessions of sin, what twisted prayers? This was no ordinary confinement. It was a ritual. A forging of a new will in the crucible of isolation. A transfer of power that bypassed law through raw human will. Biblical parallels whisper here, the closed room like a tomb from which something new, and perhaps cursed, would emerge. Guilt, sin, attempted redemption through control. Divine retribution lurking in the legacy left behind. Outside, tension coiled. Armin paced. Sickard watched. Voisin moved silently, delivering food, her mind turning. The cane harvest continued relentlessly, but the big house held its breath. What Madame Honorine was willing to destroy to spite her daughter was everything: the land her ancestors tamed, the wealth built on generations of backs, the very name of Tibido. She would rather see it burn in unconventional transfer than let Odette claim victory. Yet in choosing Saline, the quiet, literate, patient one, she invited into that room a witness whose endurance might outlast her hatred. A woman who carried her own mother's stolen knowledge in quiet strength. The clock ticked. Smoke from the sugar fires curled into the sky like unanswered prayers. And behind the locked door, history itself was being rewritten in ink, blood, and shadow. 11 days. When the overseer finally broke the lock on November 14th, the scene inside would haunt the parish for decades. Documents burned. Secrets carried out in an apron. Lining. A family's fortune redirected in ways that challenged every assumption about power in the final years of the antebellum South. But that breaking of the door is not the heart of this tale. The heart lives in those 11 days: what was spoken, what was signed, what spiritual transaction occurred between a dying mistress and the enslaved woman who held the key. A transaction that would echo far beyond Bellefontaine, touching themes of justice, redemption, and the haunting truth that no sin remains hidden forever. The river kept flowing. The cane kept burning. And in that shuttered room, two souls confronted eternity. The lock had clicked shut. Outside, the sugar mill continued its merciless roar. Inside Madame Honorine Tibido's bedchamber, time slowed to the scratch of a pen and the ragged breath of an old woman consumed by hatred. This was not mere illness or family quarrel. It was a ritual of spiritual corruption, a deliberate forging not only of documents, but of truth itself. A sin that carried the weight of false witness, the biblical prohibition that damns the soul as surely as murder. Part 2: The Hand That Wrote Damnation. Under the Napoleonic Code that still governed Louisiana in 1853, a parent could not easily erase a child from their legacy. Odette, as the sole surviving child, was entitled by unbreakable law to 3/4 of the estate, the legitime. Honorine could freely dispose of only the remaining quarter. No ordinary will, sale, or gift to nephew Armin could defeat this. Unless she could prove one of the 10 specific grounds for disinheritance listed in Article 1521 of the Civil Code of 1825. Grounds like striking a parent, attempting their life, or refusing ransom if held captive. Most required dramatic, witnessed physical acts. Almost impossible to fabricate convincingly. Except the 9th. A child who refused food or support to a parent in necessity could be disinherited if the parent swore to it in authentic form before a notary and 2 witnesses, specified the cause, and affirmed it under oath while of sound mind. This became Madame Honorine's weapon. She would swear that during her stroke-induced illness the previous winter, Odette had ignored 3 letters begging for remittances. She would produce copies of those desperate pleas and alleged replies from Odette, cold, heartless refusals. All fabricated. All created in the sealed sanctuary of her bedchamber. And the instrument of this forgery would be Saline. Why Saline? Because Honorine's left side was paralyzed. Her right hand trembled so violently she could no longer form consistent letters. She needed someone literate, someone with a steady hand, someone who had studied her handwriting for years while serving her. Someone who could imitate it under supervision. Someone legally invisible, a slave whose testimony would hold no weight in court and whose silence was guaranteed by ownership. In a society that forbade enslaved people from reading or writing, the entire machinery of wealth, inheritance, and generational power now rested on the forbidden hand of a 26-year-old woman taught in secret by her dying mother. There is profound spiritual irony here. The very system designed to crush the human spirit now depended on the quiet strength it had tried to destroy. Perhaps the hand of providence moved even through chains. Or perhaps it was judgment allowing evil to overreach until it collapsed under its own weight. The room itself became a confessional of deceit. Heavy shutters sealed out the autumn light. A small writing desk had been moved beside the grand four-poster bed. Candles and an oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across cypress walls and dark heartpine floors. The air grew stale with the scent of ink, aged paper, medicine, sweat, and the faint sweetness of cane smoke drifting through cracks. The distant crack of whips and calls of drivers in the fields felt like another world. Saline sat for hours at that desk. Madame Honorine, propped against pillows, dictated in a low, venomous murmur. Her voice never wavered in purpose. Write it again. Make the refusal colder. She must sound like a serpent. Saline's hand moved steadily. She had practiced for 2 years watching her mistress. She imitated the elegant, slightly slanted French script. First, copies of letters Honorine supposedly sent, pleas for money, descriptions of suffering, appeals to daughterly duty. These were easier. Saline knew her mistresses hand intimately. Then came the harder forgeries, replies from Odette. Saline had never seen Odette's adult handwriting. But in the sealed leather portfolio lay 2 genuine old letters Odette had written to her father years earlier. Saline studied every loop, every crossing of T, every flourish. On practice scraps she mimicked until her fingers cramped. Then she produced curt, dismissive responses, letters portraying Odette as ungrateful, greedy, heartless. The masterpiece was an affidavit supposedly written by Odette to a St. Louis notary, a cold acknowledgement that she had received her mother's pleas and chosen to ignore them. This document was crafted to surface later, devastating any challenge Odette might raise. Each night, Saline worked by flickering light. Madame would examine every page with her good eye, holding it close, sometimes nodding approval, sometimes demanding it be burned in the small porcelain dish by the bed. The smell of burning paper mixed with the room's confinement, like offerings on an unholy altar. Paper itself was a science of deception. Fresh sheets would betray them. Madame had hoarded blank portions cut from old correspondence for years, sheets from 1852, 1851, 1850, carefully labeled and stored. They aged them further with diluted coffee, added iron gall to the ink for authentic browning. Every detail had to withstand scrutiny. Outside the chamber, suspicion simmered. Madame Voisin, the Creole housekeeper, was the first to sense the rot. On the morning of October 13th, she brought breakfast. The door cracked open only enough for Saline's slender hand to take the tray. Voisin glimpsed the writing desk, papers, inkwell, and Saline guiding Madame's trembling hand, or perhaps writing herself. The door slammed shut. That evening, Voisin confronted Armand Pontalba. He was drunk, as usual by nightfall. He dismissed her coldly, his aunt deserved privacy. Mind your place, or lose it. Yet after Voisin left, Armand climbed the stairs. He stood outside the door for a long time. He heard his aunt's low dictation. The steady scratch of a pen. He heard no voice from Saline. Armand was no fool. His own desires were layered. Blood relative through his grandfather, he had arrived at Bellefontaine broke after gambling away his inheritance in New Orleans. His aunt had given him shelter and a meager allowance but repeatedly declared he would inherit nothing. The original plan, 3/4 to Odette by law, 1/4 to the Catholic Diocese of New Orleans for a charity hospital in memory of her dead son Pascal. But Honorine's hatred had metastasized. Armand now understood he was necessary to her revenge. She planned to disinherit Odette entirely via the sworn affidavit, then divide the whole estate equally, half to Armand, half to the diocese in trust for a foundation named after Pascal. Half of 720 arpents of rich sugar land. Half of 47 enslaved souls. Half of the grand old house with its 6 ancient oaks. It was wealth beyond his dreams. He had left the chamber on October 12 pale not from horror alone, but from the realization that he would become complicit in destroying his cousin. A flicker of the boy who once sat on his aunt's knee on the gallery ward with the greedy man he had become. He rode for the notary anyway. Notary Auguste Delacroix was a man caught between conscience and code. 61 years old, meticulous, experienced in the cruelties wealth breeds. He knew upon arrival what was intended. He had reviewed Article 1521. He took Madame's declarations. He noted the supporting evidence. In his private journal, he recorded disturbing observations. All documents appeared written in the same hand, Madame's own. Phrasing in the forged Odette letters used Louisiana French idioms. Unlikely for a woman who had lived in St. Louis for years and corresponded in English. Yet the law required only the parent's sworn statement while of sound mind. Madame was lucid. Delacroix sealed the documents. He placed them in his locked chest. But he also wrote secretly to Odette in St. Louis, urging her to come at once on estate matters. That letter would arrive too late. Inside the chamber, the spiritual weight pressed heavier each day. Saline wrote lies that could condemn a daughter and enrich a nephew. She forged accusations that violated the commandment against false witness. Honorine, in her frailty, played God with legacies, blind to the judgment her actions invited. The room became a microcosm of the plantation system itself, oppression hidden behind legal fictions, sustained by the very people it enslaved. Saline's terrible patience held. She did not complain. She did not refuse. Yet in the quiet moments between drafts, as Madame dozed, perhaps Saline reflected on her mother Philomene dying without care. On the thousands of lashes in the fields. On the divine scales that eventually balance all accounts. The cane harvest raged outside. Smoke rose like incense to indifferent heavens. Armand waited and drank. Voisin watched and planned. Sicard sensed the end approaching. Day after day, Saline's hand moved. Letters accumulated. The stack of forgeries grew. Each completed page was a nail in the coffin of truth. Each burned failure sent ashes swirling like lost souls. Madame Honorine's voice grew weaker but her will stronger. Make her cruelty believable, girl. She must deserve what is coming. Saline obeyed. But in her silence, she carried something Madame could not see, the moral authority of the oppressed. The quiet power that outlasts empires built on sin. By early November, the forgeries neared completion. The notary's visit had planted seeds of doubt. Odette's journey from St. Louis had begun, unknowingly racing toward a changed destiny. 11 days total. The chamber held its secrets like a tomb. But tombs, as scripture reminds us, do not always keep what is placed inside them. Sometimes, light breaks through. Sometimes, truth escapes in the lining of an apron or the memory of a witness. What Saline wrote in that room was more than ink on paper. It was a covenant of betrayal. A spiritual transaction whose cost would be paid not just by the Tibido name, but by every soul touched by its consequences. The pen scratched on. The mill fires burned. And somewhere in the divine order, the scales began to tip. The forgery was not simple deception. It was an act of meticulous craftsmanship, a dark art performed under the dim glow of oil lamps in a shuttered tomb. Every detail had to withstand the scrutiny of notaries, lawyers, and courts. Madame Honorine had prepared for years. Iron gall ink, common in the 1850s, oxidized over months into a distinctive brown. Fresh ink would betray them instantly. Madame kept a small bottle of heavily oxidized ink salvaged from her husband Leopold's correspondence after his death in 1838. She diluted it carefully for the most critical documents. Paper aging required precision. Diluted coffee spotted only at the corners to mimic natural foxing. Folds simulated years of travel in saddlebags and storage in drawers. Creases had to look authentic, handled repeatedly. Saline mastered these techniques in just 3 days. The hardest element remained the handwriting. A person's script evolves like a voice. Madame's hand in 1853 trembled and slanted differently than in 1843 or the 1830s. Saline studied older letters from the leather portfolio, letters to Leopold, to Honorine's own mother, even to her grandmother. She learned 3 distinct versions of her mistress's hand and reproduced them flawlessly. Odette's hand proved more challenging. Saline had only 2 old letters written to her father. She studied the round, careful strokes of a younger woman and extrapolated, how would that hand change under the pressures of a merchant's household in St. Louis after a decade? Saline imagined, practiced, and delivered. Madame watched with a mixture of astonishment, gratitude, and a bitter hatred. Here was a woman she owned by law property, producing forgeries finer than her own hand could ever manage. A technical mastery that could strip her own daughter of birthright. The irony burned. The hand she had tried to keep ignorant had become indispensable. For the first 3 days, silence ruled the chamber. Instructions came in clipped commands. Saline answered in monosyllables. They ate separately, Madame first, Saline from the scraps. The air thickened with ink, coffee, camphor rub for rheumatism, and the sour-sweet odor of prolonged illness. 2 bodies in confinement. 2 souls circling an abyss. On the 4th day, the wall cracked. Madame Honorine began to speak. Not dictate. Confess. She spoke of Pascal, her beloved son lost at 19 in a duel. The sound of his laughter. The exact shade of green in his eyes. She spoke of Leopold, the love and resentment intertwined, the bad harvests of the 1840s they survived together. She traced the family line back to grandfather Armand Tibido, who cleared the first arpents with his own hands and those of 11 Senegambian men purchased at the Chartres Street Market in 1740. She spoke of Odette as a child, terrified of Gulf storms. How Honorine had held her through thunder, believing then that she loved her daughter more than life itself. How that love had curdled into something monstrous. How hatred now kept her heart beating. She admitted the evil of it. She declared she would die with it and dragged the entire estate into its maw. Saline listened. Her pen never stopped. Sometimes Madame wept tears the old woman had not shed in decades. Saline would set down the pen, bring water in the silver cup, and occasionally take the trembling right hand in her own. Not slave and mistress. Woman to woman. In the dead of night, holding frailty as it slipped toward eternity. The room became a world unto itself. Shutters closed by day against painful light. Cracked open at night to release heat and staleness. A large carved armoire stood silent against the wall, its contents untouched and mysterious. In the corner, a small oratory held a crucifix and porcelain virgin. Madame did not pray before it during those 11 days. Her silence toward God spoke volumes. The writing desk overflowed with 3 piles, completed forgeries, rejected drafts for burning, and fresh sheets waiting. The enormous mahogany bed, where Honorine had been born 73 years earlier, would soon become her deathbed. At its foot lay Saline's narrow daybed. A porcelain basin for cold water washing. Outside, Madame Voisin shielded the household from questions. The sugar harvest continued. Cane smoke rose. But the big house held its breath. On the 5th day, Madame asked Saline to read aloud. Her eyes had weakened. She chose a book of sermons by a 17th-century French bishop, words on mercy, repentance, and divine justice. Saline hesitated. For years she had hidden her literacy. We are past pretending, Madame said. So Saline read. Her French careful and formal, her voice low and resonant. Madame listened with closed eyes. Sometimes she corrected archaic pronunciation. Often she simply said, continue. The irony was suffocating. A slave reading sermons on mercy while helping manufacture evidence to disinherit a daughter neither had truly known in years. Mercy preached in a room built on its denial. The conversations deepened. On the 6th day, Madame asked if Saline's mother Philman had been happy. Saline considered long before answering. She spoke of love. Of secret lessons in the kitchen on Sunday afternoons while the family attended Mass, letters traced with a stick and flour so no evidence remained. Learning is the one thing they cannot take from your head, Philman had taught. Saline did not say if she herself had been happy. Madame did not press. On the 7th day, what do you want, Saline? If you could have anything? Saline's reply came quiet as breath, to live somewhere no one can knock on the door and take me away. Madame closed her eyes for 2 hours. On the 8th day, questions turned personal. Did Saline love her mother? Yes. Did Philman love her? Yes. Then, in a voice thin as mist, I wish I had allowed the doctor for Philman in.
The winter of 51. No apology.
No plea for forgiveness. Just the flat statement, followed by the next dictation.
These were not redemption arcs. They were the final unraveling of a soul.
Honorine confronted her life's ledger in the presence of the one person who could never betray her in court, yet who now held the power of truth in her hands.
On the 10th day, Saline made her choice.
Madame had dozed off in the afternoon, head fallen forward, breathing ragged. Saline worked on the most dangerous forgery, the affidavit in Odette's hand, signed with Odette's forged name, falsely confessing refusal of support.
Saline paused.
She looked at the sleeping woman who had owned her life.
Then, on a fresh sheet, in her own clear hand, she wrote the truth.
She identified herself fully: Saline, property of Madame Honorine Tibido of Bellefontaine, Iberville Parish, aged approximately 26. She stated under whatever oath her condition allowed that all correspondence was forged under duress and dictation. She listed every document, described the aging methods, named the notary delequa and dates.
She signed it.
This single honest page, born of literacy passed secretly from grandmother to mother to daughter, stood as the only truthful document in the entire conspiracy. Saline folded it carefully. She had prepared the lining of her apron days earlier, slitting the seam. She hid the paper there, against her body. Then she returned to the forgery, completed it in Odette's hand, and placed it with the others.
November 14th arrived. Saline woke before dawn on the daybed.
The room was unnaturally still. Madame's labored breathing, the constant companion of 11 nights, had vanished.
She crossed to the bed. Touched the cheek. It was cool.
Honorine Tibido had slipped away in the night, taking her hatred with her.
Saline stood motionless in the gray light.
Then she did the only thing left: she unlocked the door.
Madame Voisin appeared almost instantly. She entered, saw the body, saw Saline standing calmly by the desk piled with documents.
In one piercing glance, the housekeeper understood the scale of what had transpired.
The forgeries. The confessions. The strange intimacy. The death.
What happened next would ripple far beyond the chamber.
Documents would burn. Secrets would travel hidden in apron linings.
A sheriff would be paid in silver.
And a family's fortune would twist in ways no one anticipated.
Spiritually, the room had become a crucible.
Two women from opposite worlds forged more than documents.
They confronted the weight of sin, the fragility of legacy, the power of hidden knowledge, and the quiet endurance that outlasts empires. Honorine sought control beyond the grave, weaponizing hatred against blood. Yet in her final days, she revealed the human core: regrets, memories, the ache of curdled love. Saline, the patient vessel, carried both the lies and the singular truth. Her secret literacy, passed like contraband through generations, became the instrument of potential justice. A biblical reversal, the stone the builders rejected becoming the cornerstone.
The enslaved hand recording both damnation and deliverance.
The closed room mirrored the human heart, shuttered, stifling, filled with flickering light and shadows. What was born there carried the scent of ink and illness, but also the faint whisper of redemption. Not for Honorine, perhaps, but in the legacy her actions unleashed.
Outside, the live oak stood sentinel. Spanish moss swayed. The Mississippi flowed on, indifferent yet carrying every secret eventually to the sea.
The sugar fires still burned, turning Cain into wealth built on suffering. But inside that chamber, a death and a hidden document had altered the course of Bellefontaine forever. The overseer would soon break more than just the lock. The truth, once released, would prove harder to contain than any forgery.
The silence after death is never truly silent.
In the shuttered bedchamber of Bellefontaine on the morning of November 14, 1853, the absence of Madame Honorine Tibido's labored breathing felt louder than any mill roar or cane knife. The air hung heavy with ink, burnt paper, camphor, and the final sour-sweet scent of a life extinguished. Saline stood beside the bed for a long moment, her tall frame steady despite 11 days of confinement.
She touched the cool cheek once more, then crossed to the door. The key turned. The lock clicked open.
Madame Voisin moved with the precision of a woman who had survived revolutions and buried generations of the same family.
51 years of service had taught her when to act and when to protect.
She did 3 things in rapid succession. First, she stepped inside, closed the door, and locked it again, with Saline still inside. Second, she descended and woke Overseer Bertrand Sickard, telling him only that Madame had passed quietly in the night and the chamber must remain sealed until proper authorities arrived. Third, she sent a stable boy not to the hungover Armand Pontalba, nor directly to Notary Delacroix, but to Father Etienne Rouet, the Breton priest at the nearby Catholic church, with a whispered instruction: come to witness, not to administer last rites.
When the priest arrived at 8 o'clock, Voisin led him upstairs. She unlocked the door.
The 3 of them, priest, housekeeper, and enslaved woman, stood in the presence of the dead mistress.
There, in the grey morning light filtering through cracked shutters, Saline spoke. She told everything. The dictation.
The forgeries. The aging of paper and ink. The conversations about love turned to hatred. The sermons on mercy read in a room built on its denial. Then she reached into the lining of her apron, the seam she had carefully slit days earlier, and produced the single sheet written in her own hand on the 10th day.
The truthful affidavit. The moral witness that named every deception. Father Etienne Rouet read it twice.
His face remained calm, but his eyes showed the weight of what he held. In that moment, he made a choice that would later cost him his position in the diocese. He folded the paper, placed it inside his cassock, and said simply to Voisin, "We will say that Madame was alone."
They descended. The official story was set.
Madame had dismissed her maid the previous evening and died alone. Armand was roused. He entered the chamber, saw the pile of documents, and understood instantly what they represented.
The ink on several was barely dry.
Yet in what may have been the only truly honorable decision of his adult life, he said nothing.
He gathered them.
Later that evening, alone in the bedchamber, Armand burned every forgery in the fireplace. The flames consumed weeks of careful deception. He never knew that the most dangerous sheet, the truthful one, had already been carried away by the priest. Armand's calculations had shifted in the final days. If the forgeries succeeded and Odette was disinherited, endless litigation would follow. The diocese would challenge.
Experts would examine handwriting.
Lawyers would devour the fortune.
Even victory would leave him ruined.
Under the old will, Odette received 3/4 and the diocese the disposable quarter. Armand inherited nothing. But he knew Louisiana law. If Odette died childless, as she had so far, he stood as nearest collateral relative. Odette was 41, sickly, and suffering from what doctors quietly called breast cancer.
Armand chose patience over immediate greed.
He burned the evidence.
Odette arrived on November 18.
She wept not from grief for her mother, but from relief that the nightmare she had feared for a decade had not materialized.
Her husband Hyacinthe Caillou took possession.
Within a week, Armand received $2,000, his horse, and a polite but firm dismissal from Bellefontaine.
He returned to New Orleans and died of typhus 4 years later. Odette lived another 11 years.
Childless. She died in 1864 as the Union blockade ruined her husband's business. Bellefontaine eventually passed to Hyacinthe, who sold it in 1869. The house became a rice mill, then burned in 1902. Today only foundations remain in a cleared field, silent witnesses to a dynasty's end.
Father Etienne Rouet left the parish in 1854 under a quiet disagreement with his bishop.
He served a small mission in Illinois for 20 years and died in 1876.
Among his papers was an envelope marked "The Truth from Bellefontaine."
Inside, his notes and Saline's statement. It sat unremarked in diocesan archives for nearly a century until discovered in 1973. The paper trail eventually led, through dusty boxes and abandoned research files, to a small historical society in Baton Rouge, where it waited for eyes that would recognize its power.
And Saline? She returned to the laundry, then to seamstress work.
She spoke of the 11 days to no one. In 1861, as war loomed, Hyacinthe emancipated 11 slaves, including her. The act survives in the Louisiana State Archives. Unconditional freedom, $180 in silver, and a letter of introduction to a free Creole family in New Orleans.
She made a life. Worked as a seamstress in Faubourg Marigny through the war.
Married Jean-Baptiste Lafleur, a free man of color and clerk, in 1868.
They had 2 children.
She died in 1891 and rests in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 in a modest above-ground tomb.
The marble inscription has nearly weathered away.
She left no diary, no letters, no spoken testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau. Her only surviving voice is that single careful page written at the small desk while her mistress slept, the document that asserted her moral existence in a world that denied her legal personhood. Madame Honorine sought to play God with legacies, wielding law and forgery like instruments of divine will. She locked the door thinking she had found the perfect, voiceless tool. Yet the thing she chose possessed a soul that refused to be erased.
Saline's secret literacy, passed like sacred contraband from mother to daughter, became the instrument of truth.
In the closed room, sermons on mercy were read aloud while manufacturing lies.
A dying woman confessed regrets without seeking forgiveness. An enslaved woman held her hand in the night. And on the 10th day, Saline chose truth over complicity.
She folded justice into the lining of an apron and carried it into the world.
This is the deeper horror and the quiet triumph of Bellefontaine.
Not merely one cruel woman's vendetta, but the machinery of an entire system that depended on the compelled silence and complicity of those it deemed less than human. A system that treated people as things, only to discover that those things carried the moral witness capable of outlasting empires. The hand can testify when the voice is silenced.
Paper outlives hatred.
Truth, hidden in plain sight, eventually surfaces.
Saline never sought credit. She simply refused to let the lie stand unchallenged in the universe.
In doing so, she asserted what the law denied: she was a person.
A witness.
A bearer of light in a shuttered room. The live oaks still stand near the old foundations.
Spanish moss hangs like memory. The Mississippi flows on, carrying stories downstream.
And somewhere in archives rests a single sheet of paper, 12 by 8 inches, written in careful French, ending with one simple signature.
That signature speaks louder than every forged document Honorine ever commanded.
It echoes across generations, a reminder that dignity cannot be fully locked away. That even in the darkest chamber, a quiet act of conscience can rewrite legacies. That the most powerful inheritance is not land, sugar, or silver, but the stubborn human refusal to let evil have the final word.
What do you carry in the lining of your own life? What truth have you hidden, waiting for the right moment to step into the light?
The voices the record was never designed to preserve are still speaking.
You only have to know how to listen.